In the year 1190, when the sun was shining bright in spring, a large number of people from the northern German cities of Lübeck and Bremen made it to the Christian siege camp at Acre. What they saw was a group of people led by King Philip II of France and King Richard III of England, who were trying to take back the holy city from the Muslims. This had belonged to the Christians before, but had been lost to Saladin some years back. In the overcrowded Christian camp on the plateau of Toron, where the hygiene was horrific and disease was a major problem, the new German arrivals had the good idea of setting up a field hospital on the spot by using the sails and rigging from one of the ships to provide shade for the sick. This was when the Ordo Fratrum Domus Hospitalis Sanctae Mariae Teutonicorum Hierosolymitanorum, or Teutonic Order for short, was supposedly established. Hardly any of those merciful Germans could have dreamt at that time that their charitable act on the warm Mediterranean coast near Acre would eventually result in the creation of a powerful state in the distant cold Prussian lands a few decades later. Once the field hospital had been established in Acre, it received a large number of donations, and Pope Clement III acknowledged it as a fully fledged hospital community in 1191. The hospital was given a house in the city when Acre was taken back by the Christians, and was granted a number of privileges to make the care of the sick and poor easier. Although the order was on a far from equal footing with the mighty military orders like the Knights Templar or the Knights of St. John at the beginning of their history, it soon grew, and during the so-called German Crusade, from 1197 to 1198, was transformed into a military order by the German ecclesiastical dignitaries and recognized as such by the Pope a year later. This step made the order a power to be reckoned with in the Eastern Mediterranean. As donations from Europe poured in, the young Teutonic Brotherhood grew in power, and new members were admitted at an alarming rate. This new military order took the rules of the Templar Knights as the basis of its own rules. It structured its organization along the example of the other big military orders. This did not mean that the Teutons were just following what other knightly brotherhoods had done. If they needed to do something different, the Teutonic Order got creative. A broad member structure of the Teutonic Order was established during the 13th century. Most of the membership of the order was made up of laymen rather than churchmen, and was divided into several ranks. The highest rank in the Teutonic Order was that of the initiated Knight Brothers, who were recognizable by their white tunics with black crosses. These full members made up the order's elite military corps and political leadership. While these knights were usually drawn from the nobility, they had to live without the noble pleasures and forego luxuries like weddings and tournaments in theory. They also had restrictions on hunting, which they could only do for the purpose of training with ranged weapons. A new member had to be 15 years of age to become a Knight Brother. A prospective brother would have the right to live in the order for 1 year and see whether it suited him. If not, he would be free to leave, but could also take the vows immediately if he so desired. In addition, the candidates had to be freeborn men without debts, nor could they be members of other orders. Furthermore, the initiates of the Teutonic Brotherhood were not allowed to marry. Despite their relatively lower status, they still seemed to be respected members of the community. During the election of the Grand Master of the Order, 4 Graumentler had to be present, showing their importance. In the 14th century, most gray cloaks seemed to be from the patrician families of the Prussian cities. The last caste of the Teutonic Order, namely one made up entirely of laymen, was the Halbkreuzler, or half-crosses. The Halbkreuzler were those who gave property, but were not or could not be fully admitted into the order. Most of them were landowners who worked the land that they had donated. In addition, the order had other members known as Magda and Diener, who performed the lowest services for the order and its increasing possessions. As we have already intimated, the Teutonic Order was not purely male, but had a female component as well. One such female rank that played an important role in the order was the half-sisters. These women did the same services in the hospitals and also worked on the other possessions of the order, being in a manner of the maidservants of the order. Above the half-sisters were the sorors, which was another female part that existed mostly out of full sisters of the order. They were women of noble families who had donated large amounts of money to the order, or who had also followed their husbands or sons into the order. In either case, they generally did no more than charitable work in the hospitals, not labor, and were intended to be maintained by the order, especially as they grew older. After discussing the lay people of the Teutonic Order, I now want to turn to the other main section of the order, the spiritual brothers, known as the spirituali. The spirituali consisted of the fully ordained priests and other lower clerics. When the Teutonic Order became a military organization, the priests and churchmen within its rank became secondary in importance to the militarized knights. In the political hierarchy of the order, priests were lower in rank to the knights. They took care of the significant spiritual needs of the knight brothers, but also generally did not advance any higher than the lower offices within the order. Moreover, they were a rising problem for Duke Conrad of Masovia in the beginnings of the 13th century, who wanted to spread his influence. When the Teutonic Order began to establish its rule over the Prussian lands, it could incorporate the established principles of the knightly orders. These principles were based on the so-called three evangelical counsels, the commandments of chastity, obedience, and poverty. These principles, which are based on the Christian monastic tradition, enabled a completely different practice of rule from that of a high medieval secular ruler, who relied on the feudal system as the basis for his rule. That meant he was often not free to appoint office holders himself. In fact, the kings had to take into account the different ranks of nobility and the nobility networks, and what was more important, they had often hereditary noble claims to fiefs, estates, and offices on top of that. Therefore, a medieval king always had to keep in mind the worldly and ecclesiastical nobles, who very often formed an active opposition to him. The king had therefore to rule with the nobles, not against them. The order was free of all this. Chastity also meant that the knight brothers could not have children to whom they could pass down their lands and titles. Therefore, the offices within the order were not hereditary, and candidates were chosen by election. Obedience also made it possible to transfer the brothers to posts and offices according to the needs of the institution. On the next hierarchical level came the Deutschmeister, who was in charge of all the possessions of the order which lay within the Holy Roman Empire, and the Landmeister in Livland, who was the head of the Livonian branch of the order. In theory, the Landmeister of Prussia would have performed the same function for his area, but after 1309, the office was merged with that of the Hochmeister, as the center of the order was relocated to Marienburg in Prussia. The Landkomturen and Komturs were the individual heads of the corresponding Komturen. When the order conquered Prussia in the mid-13th century, it began to structure the conquered area. Initially, the order divided the land into commanderies, or Komtureien, each presided over by a Komtur, which were distributed along the old tribal borders of the Prussians. The administrative core of a Komtureien or commandery was the castle-like Ordenshaus, the convents of the order. Because of the nature of the conquest and, therefore, the access to the land, these fortified converts were usually located on the outskirts of the commandery. Over time, the land of a Komture was further divided into bailiwicks and Pflegeämter. In such an administrative sub-area, a corresponding official would be appointed. More often than not, this was entrusted to the knight brothers, Graumentler, and other secular servants of the order. These Pflegeämter were the small castles from which the appointed bailiffs administered the territory under their control. They were the direct representative in the order's handlings with the Prussians and new settlers. They held court, collected taxes, and established extensive agricultural estates under the direct control of the order. These lesser officials had less leeway in the performance of their duties than the Komturen, under whose authority they were placed. In addition, they also had special officials who were masters of fisheries or forests, and oversaw the utilization of these areas economically according to the rights and laws of the order. The Teutonic Order could not simply rely on its own members for administration of the territory, as there were simply not enough brothers to do so. Instead, they called upon noblemen from the Holy Roman Empire or Prussia to manage their lands. These outsiders were often made to serve in lower jurisdictions and had to recognize the order as their overlord, pay tribute, and serve in its armies. The same applied to the Polish nobility who lived in some regions of Prussia. The difference between lands ruled by the Teutonic Order and lands ruled by the normal nobility of medieval Europe is that the office holders of Christendom's nobility did not hold their lands by hereditary right, and the order could withdraw them if necessary. Moreover, the order's territory was a contiguous dominion, so all administrative districts were subject to the same law as much as possible. This was a sharp contrast to the situation in large parts of Europe, where landlords' rights could be substantially different from one region to the next, or even between neighboring villages. The order's officials were subject to accountability in their actions and local rule, which had to be done in writing in accordance with the statutes of the order. To ensure that the individual commanderies were acting correctly, they were regularly visited by other, usually higher-ranking members of the order. These visits were organized by the chapter of the Grand Master, and, due to the order's expansion, later by the chapters of the Landmeisters and Landkomturen in Prussia. While the conquest of Prussia was still going on, the land was war-torn, devastated, and depopulated.